So I want to give Gaya the stage. Gaya first appeared on my radar when she published the research on the limits of growth report that I'm assuming you're all familiar with. And she published that in the Yale University Journal of Industrial Ecology. And it also happened to be her master thesis from Harvard. And it's probably the centerpiece of today's talk. But Gaya doesn't end there. She's a true polymath. She's worked in senior sustainability positions for many organizations like the Niederländische Bank, KPMG US, and currently Schneider Electric. But it still doesn't end. She's the founder of a foundation in the Netherlands seeking to criminalize street harassment. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in econometrics and one in sustainability studies. And in the past, she's followed pursuits in music, acting, and modeling. And on top of that, she has a family. That's a lot, right? We all do a lot, but that's really a lot. And keep an eye out. Tomorrow, there will be a letter going to the Club of Rome, if I'm not mistaken, but you can enlighten us on the details of that in a minute, co-signed by Gaya about changing the taxation system so that we can actually redistribute some wealth properly in order to create a good future. I hope I got that roughly right. Gaya, thank you so much for being here, and stage is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm very happy to be here. Let me quickly share my screen. There we go. Trust you can all see this. Yes, indeed, I'm going to tell you about my research, but also what it taught me about a way forward for us. Sebastian already mentioned this. He said predicament, and a group of thinkers and politicians from around the world already started asking this same question over half a century ago when they met for the first time in Rome, as it happened, and they called it to the predicament of humankind. Why is it that despite our unprecedented innovative capabilities, we keep having the same problems of persistent poverty, social unrest and conflict, resource scarcity, pollution, disease? Why does this keep coming back? And presumably they thought these are interrelated, but how? And these people are then called the Club of Rome because they met there, but they are global thinkers. And they asked this question to a group of MIT scientists that you see here in the middle, who are now, of course, much older, and some of them are unfortunately have passed. But they built a model, the first system dynamics model of the world. And based on that, they wrote this book that you see here on the right. They came out in 1972. And one of the main conclusions of that book was business as usual is not sustainable. If we keep business as usual, we will see a collapse somewhere in the 21st century. And it was around present time. A collapse did not mean that humanity would cease to exist. It just means technically a steep decline from a previous peak. And so that would indicate that right now we are at our peak welfare levels. So given that prospect, I thought we have a few decades of empirical data now. So maybe we can verify that model, as I assume everybody on this call is familiar with. And so that's what I did. So I've already been introduced by Thomas, but I'm a published author and systems thinker now in sustainability. Indeed, now I work at Schneider Electric in their Sustainability Research Institute, where I conduct this kind of global thinking research that doesn't necessarily need to be commercially viable immediately. It's a bit more longer term thinking about where we're heading. And by now, I've been asked to be an advisor to the Club of Rome in their Transformational Economics Commission. This World 3 system dynamics model. It's not the first model of the world, but it is the first system dynamics model of the world. We're not going to go into the details, but these are all the variables. Now, a lot of you may be familiar with the more neoclassical way of modeling, as am I. I have a master's in econometrics. I spent years working in the financial sector and then as economic policy advisor at the Dutch Central Bank. So I'm very familiar with it. But the thing with those models is that there's a lot of implicit assumptions of constancy. There are not that many endogenous variables anyway. They're typically, there's a one-on-one relationship, but the rest is assumed to be fairly constant in there. Very different in system dynamics modeling. So all the variables are directly or indirectly influencing one another. And then you can model much different kind of environments, like systems, of course. And including the world, I think, works a lot more like that, where a lot of the parts are responding to the behavior of other parts in the system. Correlations are not constant, right? The randomness, errors are not necessarily normally distributed, all those things. So that's what this model did. You can model a more complex system. You get behaviors like large delays in the system. There is a response, it just takes a long time. So it's harder to trace it back to its original cause. You have exponential growth or exponential decay, all these things that are fairly hard to capture in more traditional kind of modeling, I would say. Another thing is that with this, you can model things that are not that readily quantifiable. A lot of financial models, they can only really process things that are, they can only process numbers that are, so finance is very good with that, right? Economic, okay, we can measure unemployment, but behavioral factors, political things are all those things that we know are very important, the average health of a population. It's already getting a lot harder to incorporate that. It's easier done in system dynamics modeling. It's still a model, so it's not reality, but it can be more useful, I think. So what did they do with this World 3 model to create the book, The Limits to Growth? They conducted scenario analysis by running the model. Everybody is familiar with that. So they varied assumptions on technological innovation, the amount of available non-renewable resources, such as fossil fuels, and also societal priorities. So there you see that the more behavioral, the social aspect. These are the 4 scenarios that I used in my research. They're the business as usual in the upper left, business as usual 2, comprehensive technology on the lower left, and stabilized world. Business as usual 2 is exactly what it sounds like. They just ran the model based on historical averages. So we have had, as you could see in the model, there were many variables, but some of the key variables, for example, were global population, food production, industrial output, global pollution levels, the amount of non-renewable resources, and something that we also probably care about, human welfare levels. There were others, the ecological footprint, human services was another one, which is mainly education and health services, birth rate, death rate, those kind of variables. Business as usual, as I already told, leads to a collapse around present time. So we see, for example, industrial output, the green dashed line, show a steep decline as a result from resource scarcity. Now, the thing with resources is that fossil fuels, for example, are very hard to estimate. There's a finite amount of them. We know this, but it's hard to estimate exactly the usable amount under the crust of the earth. And so that was some of the criticism that the MIT team received. They said, well, you underestimated it. So they said, fine, we'll double it. So that's what business as usual 2 is. Double the amount of resources, and everything else is still historical averages. Interestingly, it does not avoid a collapse, but it is delayed. This subsequent decline is even steeper, and the cause changes from resource scarcity to pollution. As you can see, the pollution goes off the chart. this is very typical behavior in a closed system, which the world is. Yes, we can innovate ourselves out of some constraints, right? But then there are always consequences because things are responding to the other parts of the system. And so a new constraint arises. Typically, these constraints over time come faster and faster. That's just the behavior that you see in closed systems. So this is, if you look at pollution, they had a generic variable of pollution. I would say this includes greenhouse gas pollution. And so I interpret the business as usual too as the scenario in which the collapse is caused by a basically ecosystem breakdown, including from climate change. Now, not all scenarios ended a collapse. Comprehensive technology was another one. This one is based on more than just historical averages, but the limits to growth report also got a lot of criticism where people said, but you don't take into account how innovative people are. Our innovation is limitless. Any investor knows that this is not true. It takes that humanity does have a lot of innovative capabilities, but it's not limitless. It takes time to find something, to experiment and come up with a truly new technique. The turnaround is typically about a decade before it's really commercially viable. So that's not entirely true, and by the way, nobody knows this better, I think, maybe than MIT scientists, which is what these people were. So I always thought that was a bit of a weak argument. It was very prevalent, but they basically said to MIT scientists, have you thought about technological innovation rates? And yes, they had. It was in there. It's actually a parameter. And it was set much higher, significantly higher, multiples of historic technological innovation rates to address that criticism. So it is true that in that case, the outright collapse is avoided, but it's not, declines are still there. As you can see, for example, the food we see a temporary dip there, which translates to, I would say, a significant dip in human welfare, but it rebounds, right? So there's not a collapse. There's also the stabilized world. This one deviated a lot from historical behavior. And in this one, there's also the high technological innovation rates. But on top of that, society shifts its priorities. So instead of pursuing continuous growth in industrial output, which has been a more recent historic behavior, producing more stuff to boost GDP, there's a conscious shift from resources away from industrial output towards human services. And that is the only scenario in which our human welfare index is stabilized. It's stabilized at the highest level. And as you can see, industrial output stays fairly high as well, as does the population. And pollution comes down after a while. These different kind of scenarios would be interesting to see which one we track with. As I said, we have a couple of decades empirical data now. So it was, as Thomas already said, I did this first in 2020, and that was then peer-reviewed in Yale's Journal of Industrial Ecology. It went a little bit viral after that, and a sneak peek is on the right of some of the headlines. The media just loves the word collapse. They just love it. I think it's a little bit more nuanced, and I will give my little more nuanced view on the next slide. But these are some of the headlines. Since then, I have written a book about it, about my research. It contains an update of more recent data, and also a little bit, much more about our mindsets, about what, if this is the case, what does it mean? What does this stabilized world scenario, what does it really mean? What is this society that shifts resources away from industrial output towards what I would say is meeting human needs within planetary boundaries? That's basically what happens there. What kind of values does a society have there? And is that a realistic one? Have we seen in history ever societies operating like that? So that's all in my book, which I only agreed to write, by the way, because MDPI makes it available for free online, so you can just download it. So this is this is a general, this is one variable. I typically show this one because it gives a good general impression of the outcomes. Some scenarios, some variables aligned even closer. So the empirical data, the purple dashed line, was almost basically on the scenarios. Sometimes there was more, it was more off. This is a good general impression of the overall fit across the variables that I had. So I took just mostly publicly available data from UN entities, the World Bank a lot, the ecological footprint network, those kind of things, and I plotted that with the 4 scenarios. And what I found was a fairly close alignment to the scenarios, fairly close to all of them, because they haven't diverged much yet. But as you can see, and what was also predicted, is that the developments in the next upcoming few decades are very different. And so they have, especially business as usual 2 and comprehensive technology, have not diverged much yet as of today. So that's why I couldn't distinguish between them. So empirical data aligned most closely to these 2 scenarios. They aligned least with stabilized worlds scenario, and business as usual was in between. So what does that mean? This is the human welfare variable, arguably the one we'd be most interested in, right? That it's a very close alignment. That would suggest that indeed we are right now at our peak welfare levels. And what we decide to do today, this upcoming decade at most, will determine our welfare levels at the end of this century. And so that's one of the main conclusions of my research. We have a now or never moment to change around our society. It is not really an option to keep growing. Our welfare levels, there's no scenario in which the welfare levels keep going up. And of course, we've seen this around the world. We see a global stagnation in reported happiness as well as in global growth. So the choice we have is not whether or not we keep growing, it's whether or not we maintain our current levels of welfare or if they go down. If we want to maintain them, we have to redefine our core values and paradigms. It's just a little bit greener, a little bit more of the ESG is not going to cut it. We are out of time, certainly now, for that. Now, sometimes I have people say, yeah, but wait, we're aligned most closely to business as usual too. That sounds pretty bad. That's ecosystem collapse, but we're just as close to comprehensive technology. And we don't have a collapse in that, so maybe we're just following that. That's a lot of wishful thinking. It's the short answer. There's not really a lot of evidence for that. And there's also a lot of much more evidence for the other one. My research aligns very much with all the other research of, let's say, Wackernagel's global ecological footprint that shows that we are already above Earth's carrying capacity since the 70s. Or the IPCC giving humanity a code red for climate change. We had the global risks report of the World Economic Forum come out today that actually said, based on our analysis of how our risks interconnect in our global system, we have about 2 years before we reach irreversible tipping points. Rockstrom and his team has mapped the planetary boundaries, 9 of them, a majority of which humanity has already broken. So there's not a lot of evidence for not following business as usual too, I would say. I also don't think it's just likely if you think about the assumed technological innovation rates. So these are significantly above historic averages. And we see that also in reality. We do see, for example, increased efficiencies, but only to the point where they are directly short-term profitable. Otherwise, it's not happening. And that's not the amount of innovation rates that we need. We need them to be way more. And I don't see how we would get that unless we also make systemic changes in our, for example, our economic system and how we value natural capital, that sort of thing. Also, and this goes to the question that we're going to be exploring more later, it's not the right question to ask. Can we also be following CT scenario? Nobody knows the future for certain. Anything is possible. But remember, that was never the best case scenario to begin with. Why would we settle for a CT scenario when we can also have this stabilized world scenario with higher global welfare levels? Why would we want to hang on to this growth paradigm if it's not even leading to us being happier? Why would we use our innovative powers to invent robot pollinators to replace the bees if we also have a choice to invest in regenerative agricultural practices that do not have the side effects of insecticide and polluting waterways and that sort of thing? Why would we use drones to plant new trees when we can also start valuing natural capital more, and so that existing forests are not cut down? And so that's really the question that we should be asking. What scenario do we want to be following? Because now that humanity has attained global reach, we can now change global weather patterns and we can change our DNA. This is unprecedented power. And that now limits to growth forces upon us the question, who do we want to be and what world do we want to live in? This is not a question that's been explored much because it was a ridiculous question to ask for most of human history. Absolutely, it's lunacy because we did never have that power, but now we do. And so we get to shape our own destiny, and we haven't really thought this question through much. And we're running out of time to come up with a good answer. So these societal these shifts in societal priorities, different goals, different values, you do actually see that there's a growing desire for that. You see a lot of social unrest when the younger generation is saying system change, not climate change. It alludes to that, right? It shows that awareness. You see this in a lot of surveys that the majority of people around the world are losing faith in the capitalist system. That points to me not necessarily even to adopting an entirely different system, but they're not happy with how it's currently functioning, right? And capitalism has been reinvented in history, and we can reinvent it again, because ultimately, not to go too much Yuval Harari, but it's just a story that we use to collaborate together, and we can change that story. So you see this around the world, that the majority of people are aware that we're approaching tipping points, that what we're doing is unsustainable, and they want deep systemic changes, and not just any systemic changes. They also want these things of prioritizing health, well-being, and the planet, which is basically, again, is what this society does in a stabilized world scenario. Where I live in the US, also Republicans, they do see these growing inequalities, including income inequality, as a problem. The majority of even Republicans support raising taxes on wealthier Americans. You see this in Japan too, especially the younger generation wants more emphasis in our system. They want political and economic changes towards, again, well-being things. They say prioritizing caregiving, shorter work hours, all those things that just simply, I think, go into well-being. Now, there's a lot of work being done around this too. There's a lot of research and scientific works, but also people putting it in practice. For example, Bhutan is a well-known example of a government who has been doing this for a long time, right? I think most people know that they are working with this gross happiness index, which includes equity, social equity, good governance, but also the ecological sustainability. So all these things go in there. There are also some Western countries that have now joined the WEAll, which is WeGo, which is under WEAll, which is basically well-being economics research around in their case, how to govern with the well-being of your citizens in mind and not just to spur national GDP. There are several economic frameworks that have been introduced and are gaining traction under the broad umbrella term of well-being economics. There's the donut economics that I think is particularly useful by Kate Raworth, which also explicitly takes, instead of this continuous growth, says, no, the goal of our economy should be to meet human needs within planetary boundaries. So that's the donut. The inner ring of the donut is our social foundation. So those are our human needs that should just be met. We cannot fall out of the donut there. But then also we cannot go outside of it because the planet cannot support us beyond that. There's a lot of work being done around that. There's, again, a lot of work by, let's say, the new economic foundation about exactly what does that mean, well-being. There's a misconception that well-being is hard to measure. It's not straightforward, but it's actually not harder than economic activity. This idea that the GDP is a neutral number, this is simply not true. It's not that good a measure of economic performance at all. The one who actually invented it, Kuznets, also said that at the time. He said, I don't think this is a good measure. It should not be used for measuring economic performance, but the world just went with it, right? So it doesn't measure economic performance all that well anyway. But I think the world just went with it because economic performance isn't that straightforward to measure. And I don't think it's easier than well-being. So we might as well try to measure well-being, right? If we're going for better measurements anyway. So that's, by the way, one of those things on the left that the OECD has been doing. This is a Better Life Index as a sort of composite index, as an alternative to GDP. And there are many more initiatives that I can't go into right now. I think if you look at organizations, I work at a corporation, and some of you may do that as well. Then you can see that there's a shift there as well from compliance and reputation maybe to there's now this shift to net zero, right? But really you want to go beyond that and you want to go to net positive. So companies are exploring ways to go from this short-term growth pursuit towards sustainability and lasting prosperity. But then really ultimately the goal is to give back more than you take, to be a truly regenerative force and be a positive long-term impact, right? And so that's the kind of shifts that I see in corporations. And it starts with that mindset. That's not the end of it, but that's what it starts with. So lastly, to optimally confuse you before we go into the Q&A, this is the last slide that I want to leave you with. And I have contributed to this book as well. This is The Earth for All from the Club of Rome. They came out with it last year, so exactly on the 50th anniversary of the original Limits to Growth. They weren't spiteful, but what it came down to was basically, okay, so you didn't listen 50 years ago. You're out of time for a smooth transition, which is a shame. Because if the message had been heeded at that time, these designs of these new systems, it could have been more smooth. But since we're now running out of time, it's arguably the biggest challenge is how the speed at which we have to make this transition. And so they produced a new analysis with a new system dynamics model to identify leverage points in the system. No system is random, which means there are certain points where there is more influence if you work in those specific points than in others. That's how influencers work, right? If I say something on YouTube, it has less impact. I have less leverage than if Barack Obama says it. These are the 5 leverage points in the system. Anything you do in sustainability is important. Leverage does not equate importance. But if you want to have a disproportionate impact, you might want to work in energy. This is not new to anybody. We need to make a shift to renewable energy. We need to have better efficiency, and everything that can be electrified should be electrified. There's the food. The way we produce our food is completely unsustainable. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in regenerative agriculture, but also we need to shift our behavior. We can't, eating meat every day is not sustainable. It's also not healthy. And there's an enormous food waste in the system as it is. We throw away a lot of our food. It depends on where you are. I think in the US, it's about 40% of all food, which is just an indefensible amount. The other three, though, are social leverage points, which is very interesting. So we know that we need to make this energy transition and the food transition, but arguably we would need to start in the social leverage points, because it already makes a lot of sense to shift to make this energy transition, but it hasn't happened mostly because of more of behavioral factors, political, say social. A large factor in it is the enormous inequality. So income and wealth inequality within countries. It is a huge obstacle towards people coming together and actually make the necessary climate policy changes that are actually broadly supported. And then there's the poverty which focuses on the income and wealth inequalities between countries, which are even bigger. To quote Barack Obama, because I just mentioned him, a world in which 1% owns 99% owns most of the world's, the 99% owns very little, will never be stable, right? We see this play out on the geopolitical stage right now. We see the Russian attack on Ukraine, which is just a symbol of the attack on our democratic values. And of course, we see this with the recent coups in Germany, in the US, of course, January 6th, and then very recently in Brazil. These are unique incidences in and of themselves. They all have their unique features, but ultimately income and wealth inequality within those countries are definitely a part of that. And so the last leverage point is empowerment, particularly of women. Women are just a leverage point. Who knew that not leveraging the insights of half the population can give us suboptimal results? I don't know. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. And so with that, I conclude this presentation, and looking forward to discussing some more with you.
Thank you so much, Gaya, for these high-level and deep foundations for our conversation. Thank you. So with that, I would like to enter our little experiment in conducting the remainder of this session, and ask you to challenge Sebastian and me with a question that points at the core of what you want to convey, and that allows us to really explore in a participatory, perspectival fashion to get closer to understand and to start spanning those perspectives. So yeah, please hit us.
Yes, and I've already mentioned this question. I think as humanity, really, but let's start with this group, we have to answer the question, who do we want to be? And what world do we want to live in? And once we have that vision, obviously we have to go with, okay, so how do we get there and find pathways? But ultimately it starts with that. Who do we want to be? And what world do we want to live in?